Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
Hello and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Bosscher and I'm from Schuler Books, which has 4 locations in Michigan, but I'm in the Grand Rapids, Michigan location. And I am here with the author of Flickerstate, F.A. Davidson. Hi, F.A.
Hello.
F.A. Davidson is a freelance writer based in North Carolina. She holds a BA in English from Yale University, where she studied creative writing. She is an alum of Viable Paradise and the Tin House YA Workshop. I'm thrilled to talk to FA today and gush about Flickerstate. I loved Flickerstate. And in a second, you'll hear FA set it up for us, but I'm going to tell our booksellers right off the bat why they should sell this book to their customers. Flickerstate is an incredible book, magical boarding school YA story that brings all of the nostalgia of classic YA books with very relevant topics to today. And I absolutely loved this book. Our Indies Introduced panel absolutely loved this book. And I think that I was just absolutely hooked by the idea of this probability magic, which we'll talk a little bit about. And I think the boarding school setting, you just can't go wrong. So, FA, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for letting me gush about Flickerstate with you. And I'd love to kick us off by you giving us the elevator pitch for the book.
Thank you for your very kind words. I think of the elevator pitch as having sort of 2 levels, the very short one and then the slightly more extended one. The very short elevator pitch is just sort of a series of exclamatory sentence fragments. You know, it's like STEM-based probability magic, dark academia, interdimensional beasts, cursed incurable wounds, deadly trials, almost certain death. The narrative version of that, right? The version that contains full sentences is something like, so our protagonist, Nora Sullivan, is very probably going to die for the following reason. The same day that she learns that she is a navigator, right, which is a person who has the innate ability to manipulate probability. The same day that she learns she's a navigator, she and her father are swarmed and bitten by flicker beasts. And flicker beasts are these mysterious interdimensional predators whose bites increase risks of death by any cause, right? So if a flicker beast bites you, it's not that the physical damage of the bite kills you, but that once you're bitten, your risk of dying by murder or grisly accident or sudden disease or, you know, an anvil falling from a clear blue sky, all of that just becomes radically more likely. And there's no known public cure for these bites. Rather than getting better over time, they actually get worse. But Nora hears this uncredited but persistent rumor that there's a secret cure for flicker beast bites in a locked archive at the Academy of Navigation, which is the oldest and most prestigious probability magic school in the world. And so she's like, right, let's do this. Let's go. And she transfers, she gets through the application process and, you know, applies to transfer to the academy, eventually gets there. But once she's on campus, she learns that, you know, students mostly aren't allowed into the archives. Actually, the only students who are allowed into the archives are the senior archive assistants. And you can only become an assistant by winning a series of increasingly deranged magical trials as part of a 3-person team. Nora is flawed but self-aware. She knows that she is a sort of cranky control freak, and she's like, oh no, please not teamwork, anything but that. And, you know, then we're off to the races.
Yeah,
so that's the setup.
Absolutely. And I love that because I love our teenage character who is maybe not sure about making friends or has a hard time making friends, but is forced into a situation where she has to at least work with people, if not become friends with them.
Yeah, I enjoy that dynamic a lot, and it
Yeah.
informed a lot of the way that Flickerstate plays out.
Absolutely. So I got the privilege to talk to you a little bit before we started this interview. And you told me that you have been writing for most of your life. But what does it mean to you now that you have a book published and on shelves for readers?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So for those listening, we are recording this on Friday, July 31st, and Flickerstate officially comes out August 4th, although I've already started having launch events. So the book is actually in circulation, but it is available everywhere on August 4th. So that's very soon. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've fully cognized yet the idea of having readers because, when we talked earlier, basically, I think if I remember correctly, what I said is that, I'd been writing for a long time and I'd actually had two previous books that were submitted to editors that eventually died on submission. And I sort of had to not think about having readers. I had to think about, is it worthwhile to me to continue writing if no one except my long suffering family and friends, if no one ever reads my work? And the answer for me was yes, right? That the sort of intellectual and creative challenge of writing and the sort of virtue of perseverance that it forces upon you and all that kind of stuff made writing books worth it, even if nobody read them and nobody cared that I was doing it. So that's like the stoic position to take on your writing, and I think it is healthy, because otherwise, you're living and dying by every email about your books, whether or not they're gonna go anywhere. That said, as the very probable future of my book being out in the world comes ever nearer, there is like a segment of my brain that's just sort of devoted to a high-pitched scream related to the idea of having a general readership, this idea that people who don't know me, who are not my family and friends, and have no reason to care about me as an individual and, whatever, will pick up my books solely because they are interested in the world and in the story taking place in that world. And I'm just really delighted by that possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So I want to go back to the magic system because kind of the joy and problem of every fantasy book is how do you build a magic system? And your magic system is based on probability. Where did this idea come from for you, and how difficult was it to create something that made sense?
Um, yeah, so where did it come from? It's funny. I have a zero draft of this book, a sort of proto Flickerstate, although it didn't have a title at the time, that I wrote 30,000 words of and then abandoned. Like I have the notebooks and I have the Word doc, and that proto draft, that zero draft, it has Nora, although for some reason her name lacks the ending H in this particular draft. It's just Nora in that one, and it's told in the third person for reasons that are unclear. Um,
It's like Nora's like evil twin at this
right,
point.
right.
That's how I'm going to imagine it.
It's multiversal Flickerstate, although as we'll get to, this is not actually a multiverse novel. So it had Nora, and it had creepy beasts, and it had a slightly ominous boarding school, right? But I was just like riding vibes for 30,000 words and not quite knowing what was going on or what the beast bites did or why the school was so ominous or why Nora had no H at the end of her name, And if I remember correctly, and it's difficult to know for sure because I don't put dates on my notebooks and I should really start. Actually, I have started now. I'm like, let's impose retroactive order on this chaos. But at the time, I didn't. I think what happened is that I got a revise and resubmit on one of my previous novels from an editor. And so I shelved Proto Flickerstate to do that. And when I finished, I still had no idea what was going on in Proto Flickerstate. So I wrote an entirely different novel. And then I finished that novel. And then it was COVID. And I was reading all-cause morbidity and mortality articles because it was lockdown and we all had to make our own fun. And I suddenly had this thought, wait, those creepy interdimensional beasts, what if their bites increase your risk of death by all the ways you might have died anyway instead of killing you directly, right? And I was like, oh, okay, yes, let's go with that. Who fights them? Obviously, probability magicians. that was my immediate next thought. I'm like, okay, Nora is a probability magician. That's clear. Also, there's an H at the end of her name now. And I was pretty much off to the races there. And this, brought with it a bunch of other sort of thematic and world building content that we can maybe talk about later. But that was pretty much how I started with probability magic. I actually began with the monsters and then tried to figure out who would fight them. And it was people who could, change the probability that certain future events would happen because of the way that the beast bites are also probability based. In terms of how to make it make sense, because it is sort of an abstract concept, I guess there are two ways of addressing that question. And one just has to do with it's like a craft question about exposition. Nobody likes an info dump. Actually, some of us do. I will read your historical appendix in your epic fantasy novel, but not everyone will, and it's better not to put the appendix right in the middle of a chapter. That's what appendices are for. So I was like, okay, how do we dramatize and make immediate an abstract and mathematical magic system? One way is that pretty much all of the exposition occurs at the same time as a plot goal, like something that contains stakes and also some interpersonal conflict. So for example, the first chapter is Nora's interview at the Academy of Navigation after she's applied to transfer. And part of the interview requires her to demonstrate understanding of concepts related to probability magic and also to demonstrate her own navigation, her own probability magic. And so this actually requires a sort of conflictual dialogue or negotiation between Nora and her interviewer about what is true, right, about probability magic. And it requires Nora to enact some of these things. So in that chapter, there's some interpersonal conflict between Nora and her mother, who's chaperoning her to the interview and from whom she is keeping an important secret, right? And then there's conflict between Nora and her interviewer, who's an oddbird, an interesting character. And then there's further conflict that I'm not going to spoil, right? So there's a lot of stuff happening as the information about the magic system is being explained and illustrated, which I think is very important. A scene should always be doing multiple things. I like it. It's like the Swiss Army knife of fiction. It's the rule. The other thing to consider, though, is okay, does the magic system make sense conceptually, right? And that actually, whether you think it makes sense, you generally hear, is going to depend on certain presuppositions or commitments you have about the deep structure of reality. Right?
Fair.
About influencing possible futures. What do you have to believe, right, about the nature of time, or whether free will exists, or do we exist in a multiversal reality or not, right? And so there are no appendices about that in Flickerstate. I just made some choices. So in Flickerstate, it's not a multiverse, right? There are uncountable and possibly infinite possible futures, but they all sort of funnel ultimately into a single present and a single past, right? And people do have free will, right? It's not that, the past is a closed physical system and it determines the present and the future. People do have genuine choices. So yeah, so if you believe in freedom of will and the reality of the past and present and a growing block theory of time, then all those implicit presuppositions will make sense to you. But if you're like, no, we really do live in a multiverse, but also free will doesn't exist, maybe you're like, this is not true. And that's okay. Because, like, for example, I read or watch time travel stories and enjoy them, even though I think that traveling to the past and changing things, as I briefly mentioned in Flickerstate, would probably create a reality destroying paradox. I can enjoy it even if that doesn't happen. We just have a philosophical disagreement.
No, I love that. And I genuinely feel like the probability magic in this book is not too complicated to understand. I think that's one downfall some fantasies fall in is like, okay, I kind of like get the concept, but like I don't really understand. Like there seems to be more in the author's head than they've written on the page. Like Flickerstate, the probability magic makes sense, and it's something that I think we're writing for a teen audience here. I think it's something that teens can really grab onto and kind of like play it out with their own twist, maybe, but it will still make sense. So, this is also for like teens who maybe don't want the entire world building experience. There are so many familiar parts of the world we live in to this world. There's just this twist that changes a decent amount, but does not leave the world unfamiliar to where we currently are.
Yeah. It is an alternate history, right?
Yeah.
So they discovered the probability magic, or the probability magic invades our reality in 1945, and then things spin off from there. Yeah, but it
Yeah.
is, a sort of alternate history, funhouse mirror United States that they're living in. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So, as we're thinking about maybe our readers in this question, one of the themes that is throughout is if we have this group of people that can influence the future through this magic, but not everyone can do it. It is still like a select group of people. There's a lot of conversations about power and if power can be altruistic or if it's always going to be corrupted or like things like that. That's how I read it. But my question to you is like, what themes do you hope that readers recognize? Maybe that, or maybe other things within the book of Flickerstate.
Yeah. Yeah. I endorse this reading that you've just given. Yeah. It is a lot about unearned power and influence in a certain sense, because navigation powers are simply, they appear randomly, statistically randomly throughout the population.
Mm.
All of a sudden, any random person can just manifest navigation. And it's not hereditary, right? It's purely random, which leaves open the possibility that multiple people in the same family can have it, but that would just be an even more outlandish coincidence, right?
Right.
So nobody's done anything to earn the power or influence that they get when they become a navigator. And it's also quite rare. So then the question is, okay, and one of the characters does a little Spider-Man riff on this at one point. Like, does great responsibility come with great power, or can we just take the money and run?
Right.
Certain sense. So that is definitely a big through line. Another one had to do with the way that your social status and your class status
Mm.
impact your baseline risk of death. Right. I was writing a lot of this during COVID, and I was thinking a lot about, I was working from home and had no relevant pre-existing conditions and was in my pajamas most of the time. And my dad was working in an ICU in his 60s before the vaccines were developed, intubating people too sick to breathe on their own, right? So he was at much greater risk. But I was also aware that there were people who were at greater risk because they couldn't afford not to work, right? If they were, like if they had to choose between exposure and unemployment, they were going to choose exposure. Or there were people who couldn't afford to live where they lived without 8 roommates, which is obviously going to increase your risk, or they were living in shelters, or they were unhoused, and all of those people just had an automatic, much higher baseline risk because they had less money or no money, right? And it was like, yeah, in theory, a pandemic is an existential risk to everyone. In theory, we're all in it together, but in fact, some of us are a lot more in it than others, right? And that dynamic did inform the way that I extrapolated the impact of the flicker beasts on the society, because flicker beast manifestations, so they're native to Flickerstate, which is the sort of metaphysical realm that the navigators enter to see the possible futures and manipulate them. But they can manifest in our reality. And they manifest statistically randomly most of the time, although they are slightly attracted to like strong navigation, which means that in theory, everybody is at risk from flicker beasts. But because their manifestations are probabilistic, right, navigators can demanifest them, can like see the possible future where they simply go back to Flickerstate rather than attacking and sort of push probability toward that outcome. Which means that navigators, who are rare, are in demand as bodyguards, right, from politicians and businessmen and like random ultra wealthy people, which means that there are, of course, fewer navigators to work in public service and emergency response. And so the inciting incident that occurs before the narrative actually starts is, a swarm manifests in Nora's front yard, and like there's no way the emergency response team is going to come in time because they are simply too overworked and understaffed. There's a whole subplot about the government cutting funding for emergency beast response that is not, it's not foregrounded, but it's definitely present.
Yeah.
So that question about social and economic status, and the question about how we allocate public resources, and the question about whether we should use our talents to make as much money as we can and protect ourselves, or maybe be in a riskier situation ourselves and help other people, all of that is very present in the subtext and sometimes the text.
Yeah. And that's something that I think you have done excellently in this book, and that great books do, in that it brings up concepts and realities, again, of our real world, but in a way that's not like, oh, I'm going to tell you the direct correlation to this. You're gonna make your own assumptions, and you're gonna make your own conclusions from this, but it's you can process those things in a different world and then be like, oh, that's a lot like our world, and I wonder how that works in my life. And I think this book will bring up a lot of those conversations, which I'm excited about. So one thing I love to ask authors, whenever I get a chance to ask authors questions, this is a question I ask them, and that is, what elements of your own like personality or your own personal life have you brought to life in the characters of your book?
Yeah, that's a funny one for me because my knee-jerk instinct is to say none of them, they're not me. There are seven-ish, 6 or 7 main characters, and not one of them is me 1-to-1, right? But at the same time, as I'm thinking, what are their goals and what are their desires, and what is their sort of psychological architecture and all of that, I do try to give myself a point of identification, or like an in, so that I can inhabit that different mental space and try to make them as real as possible. My point of view character, my first person narrator, is Nora Sullivan, right? And at first I would have said there's really this one main point of identification. Actually, there are 2, which maybe we can get into, that I realized later. But the main point of identification for me with her was that she is absolutely determined to accomplish this goal or die trying, right? And it's not optimism. It's not a perky can do attitude. It's just she really does not want to die in a stupid way for stupid reasons. She doesn't want that to happen to her dad. And she doesn't want her family to have to live with what will probably happen if they both die. So she's like, right, I am clinging onto the world by my fingernails, and if I get kicked off the ledge of reality, I'm going to leave claw marks. You know, that's her attitude. And that's sort of again, not necessarily optimism, not necessarily perky can do attitude, but that kind of bloody minded perseverance was very much animating my writing. Like I've been writing for a long time, and for a long time what I wrote wasn't good. And, because you just have to go through that phase of being terrible. And then for a longer time, it was starting to get good, but I still wasn't really succeeding, and I just had to keep going and going and going. And I wanted her to have that sense of, all right, I'm going to do this thing because I think it's worth doing no matter what. So she's very determined, and that determination was my in with her. The other thing that is sort of funny, and by the way, is that when I started writing the proto draft of Flickerstate, I also was getting non-specifically and ambiguously sick. And so I would go to the doctor and I'd be like, I can't like stand up all day anymore. Like I will collapse face first onto the sofa and like not be able to move for like an hour in the middle of the day. Like what's going on there? And they'd be like, well, sometimes adults are just tired. I was like, I don't know. Like I run marathons. I know what it's like to be physically tired. I've done a lot of academic work. I know what it's like to be mentally tired. This doesn't feel the same. And they would do tests and they'd be like, no, you're fine. And then, so I was like, okay, I guess I'm just, it's a weird time. Things are happening, whatever. And then I kept going. I kept working. I went back to Flickerstate, and my physical condition was getting worse for ambiguous reasons. Again, like I was even more tired, brain fog, joint pain, muscle pain, didn't know what was going on, kept writing. And then after Flickerstate was sold, and after I had completed developmental edits, by this point, I had realized that I was severely iron deficient. Like that had eventually showed up on tests, but I didn't know why. And eventually the hematologist was like, right, let's order you some additional tests because this is actually kind of weird. And then I was running my first half marathon in a long time. And I was like, I gotta be responsible because I've been feeling so tired. Maybe I'm under fueling. I'm gonna really, really carb load responsibly. So I ate like 7 bagels. And I PR'd the half marathon, and then I get my tests back from the hematologist, and they're all normal except my celiac reflex panel, which, if you don't know, it measures immune response to gluten, which causes a serious autoimmune reaction in people with celiac disease. And it's a tissue transglutaminase IgA panel. Normal value is under 15, and it measures up to 250. And my result just said greater than 250. Your immune response is simply too high for us to measure. And after my carb loading for the half marathon, I nearly, but did not end up in the ER. And they did an endoscopy, and they were like, oh, usually we have to take a sample, and we will do that, but the damage to your small intestine is actually visible to the naked eye. I was like, oops. Okay, so all the descriptions as I was going back through for copy edits of Nora feeling exhausted and sick and full of dread, I was like, oh, I guess that was some somatic projection, maybe. Not
You're maybe
required.
processing a few things through.
Yeah, so that was funny. Again, like not at all necessary to understand the novel and not actually part of the reality of the novel, but a funny Easter egg for me, as I was going back.
I like that though, and like that's such a crazy story, and I'm sorry you had to go through it, but I'm glad you found answers. But also maybe reassuring to some readers to know that like chronic illness actually did play a part into this, even if it is not explicitly stated like that. But that a lot of people experience some vague sickness that is hard to identify and they have to work through on a daily basis.
Yeah, that causes a fair amount of existential dread, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, FA, I could talk to you literally all day. I'm having such a great time, but we should probably kind of wrap up this conversation.
Yeah.
Um, and so my final question is, I want to know, and I'm hoping other readers will want to know, is this a planned standalone, or will we see this world again? And if we won't see this world again, what else are we working on?
So the short and unsatisfying answer is that I don't know. So Flickerstate was pitched as a standalone with series potential. And I think that that is true in the sense that there is a self-contained plot arc and a self-contained character arc in Flickerstate. And so it is a standalone. It also, there is certainly room for other things to happen. I tried to create an ending that was simultaneously satisfying in itself and would allow for more events, as life always does. But I do have, I was contracted for 2 books with my contract and 2 standalones, and I'm writing the other one right now. And I'm sort of hip deep in the super chaotic 0 draft right now, which is always an interesting experience for me. People talk about pantsing and plotting, and I have written 3 or 4 30-page each synopses for this project, and I've written a whole bunch of first draft material, and even so, I'm like, anything could happen. Because I write synopses to prove that I can, and then I almost immediately deviate from them. So it's a wild ride. I will say, so it is young adult fantasy, but whereas Flickerstate was what's called like contemporary fantasy, it's like alternate history fantasy, takes place in the contemporary moment in a sort of alternate version of our reality. This one is second world fantasy. So it's a world that I'm inventing from the ground up. And that is very fun, but also very galaxy brain inducing, So I'm still working through all of the ramifications and deciding what technological level, the characters have access to and exactly how I want the magic system to work and all that kind of stuff. Figuring out who knows what, which is, it's fun. It's like the pure, messy, anything could happen stage, which is great.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you so much. I cannot wait for Flickerstate to be in the world to sell it to all of the people that I interact with. And I can't wait to follow your career as we know that this is just the beginning and I hope it is a long one. But thank you so much for talking to me today.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope I get the chance to visit your bookstore sometime.
Absolutely. We would love to have you.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA site at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!